I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Democratic Strategist Baer. Lauren is a former State Department official and spent 6 years in the Obama administration, working as a senior advisor to Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. When she ran for Congress in Florida's 18th district in 2018, Baer's campaign gained national media attention because she won more votes in the district than any other Democrat in the midterm elections. Baer joins me to discuss her campaign and what it was like running for Congress as a mother and as an open LGBTQ candidate. We also discuss the importance of foreign policy given America's decline on the world stage under Trump's presidency. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Baer. Baer, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you ran for Congress in Florida's 18th district, and that was in 2018. And, Florida is an interesting state. What was your district like?
Florida is an interesting state, and running was really, I think, the most remarkable and meaningful experience that I've had in my lifetime. Florida's 18th district sort of straddles that line where Florida goes from being South Florida to being a little bit more like the Deep South. So it's got half of Palm Beach County in it, but also the entirety of Martin County and St. Lucie County above that. It's the district where I was raised, where multiple generations of my family ran a family furniture business. It's a place I care about really deeply, and it's a place that I believed in 2018 wasn't getting the kind of representation that it deserved in Congress, and sadly, I think that remains true today.
I'm just curious because you were in D.C. for a while. You worked for the Obama administration, for Hillary Clinton. You were a senior foreign policy advisor, even to Samantha Power. And I was just wondering what it was like. I mean, because I'm from the South, I'm from Memphis, and I live in Seattle now. What was it like going, from that environment, going back to Florida? Because I'm just curious at what that transition was like for you.
Completely different worlds. I like to tell people that I knew a lot about the world of policy, but not a lot about the world of politics. And I never thought I would run for office, which made the transition to being on the campaign trail, even stranger. And maybe I should step back a little and tell you sort of why I got into this in the first place. I actually gave birth to a daughter 2 weeks before Donald Trump was elected. And I remember thinking that she was being born into one world, and then all of a sudden realizing that she'd been born into a world that was very, very different than that. And as the weeks and months wore on in the Trump administration, and as I saw the way that the Republican who is representing my home district in Florida was voting, I really knew that it was kind of one of those, if not now, then if not me, who kind of moments, that if I cared about the kind of world that I was leaving to my kid and every other kid of her generation, and that if I was going to be able to answer her in 10 or 15 or 20 years when she asked me what I was doing in the era of Donald Trump to make things better, that I couldn't sit in the sidelines. I had to get in the arena and fight. And, what I have to say is, while the experience of running was so fundamentally different than the experience of being in Washington and making policy, it was on some level so much more rewarding to be on the ground every day, interacting with the people of my community, all of the diverse members of that community, understanding what kept them up at night, what they wanted to see out of Congress to motivate them, to get them involved in the political process. It was an experience that was truly inspirational and heartening and challenging all at once, but ultimately just a real lesson on movement building and what a community can do if they come together.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thinking back on 2016, and anyone that I've talked to who had a child around that time or who had young children, my son was in kindergarten. And I remember, and I don't know if you felt this way too, but I remember preparing to explain to him a world that was very different from the one we actually ended up with, right? I was prepared to, talk about, transitioning from Obama to, the first woman president. And I was just so proud. And I remember telling people, I'm so proud of this moment, and I'm so excited to tell him about this world, this country that we live in right now, and then having to shift the message, and that's really interesting. And I understand why that would drive you to get into politics.
I think you're exactly right about thinking about shifting the message. I mean, for me, what I remember in the first days that I held this baby daughter in my arms was being so excited about how the only world that she would know was one where a woman could be president. And then all of a sudden, my perspective shifting to thinking, gosh, I hope that she doesn't remember the period of time during which Donald Trump was president. And my daughter is now 3 years old. We're more than 3/4 of the way through Donald Trump's first term. And I know very well now that a 3.5-year-old actually will have memories and is starting to understand the world around her and what it means to be fair and care about people. And I think it's a challenge for me as a parent every day, especially as one involved in politics, to try to teach her about what it means to be a good leader when we lack that model for good leadership at the highest levels in our country right now.
Your campaign for Congress was really historic because you won more votes in that district than any other Democrat in the midterm elections. And 2018 was a really good year for Democrats, so that's really impressive. And I'm curious about whether you're running as a mom, and being an openly LGBTQ candidate, how did that shape your campaign? Was it central to your messaging at all? Did it help you connect with certain groups of constituents?
So first of all, I mean, on the vote count thing, it was amazing. And it was an honor to mobilize my community in that way and earn more votes in the district than a Democrat ever had in a midterm cycle. And at the same time, to realize that you can do that and you can still lose. And for me, that was a real lesson. It was a lesson about what we need to do as Democrats and as progressives to win, that it's not just enough to get out more votes than we ever have before, because the other side is doing that as well. And so when I think about going into 2020, I'm constantly aware of the challenge of not just exciting the base, not just converting independents, but also bringing new folks into the fold, because that's what it's ultimately gonna take to elect a Democratic president this year and to continue to flip districts from red to blue. But the fact that I ran as an LGBT candidate, it was very important to me on a personal level. I never considered running in any way other than as my true and authentic self. And, for the most part, I was amazed at how much that was welcomed by people on the campaign trail. It really was incredible that for the most part, people just wanted to talk with me about the issues, not about the fact that I had a wife at home. But, certainly it did come up in some contexts. I'll never forget the very beginning of my campaign. I had some consultants say, do you really want to include a picture of your wife and child, of your family on this campaign mailer we're sending out? And sort of jokingly, I responded, well, what other politician with an attractive wife and a cute baby would you tell not to feature on their campaign mailer? But on some deep level, that stung because it called into question who I was. But I was committed to being open, to being authentically myself. And at the end of the day, I really think that that's part of what helped me build bridges with so many people, including folks who were very different than me. I will never forget. One day we were at an office opening and a gentleman approached me and he said, I want to let you know I'm a lifelong Republican. I didn't leave my party. I feel like my party left me, and you're going to be the first Democrat I've ever voted for. And then he pulls out his iPhone and he says, and I also want to let you know my daughters like you. And he starts showing me pictures of his daughter and her wife and their babies. And I thought, isn't this an incredible fact that my openness has allowed me to forge a bond with someone on paper who's very different than I am, at the same time that it inspired so many people like me, which is to say young kids in the community, high schoolers and college students who were themselves gay, to be inspired by a campaign and that someone like them could run for public office. So ultimately, it was really deeply rewarding to run, but to run with my full self.
Another theme I've heard from women who run for office is about the dynamics between people who manage their campaigns and the candidates themselves, right? In relation to, what you've just talked about. There's always this kind of negotiation between the candidate and, who they want to be on the campaign and what that campaign manager wants them to express or wants them to be, right? And with women, it's usually almost always around their family or their personal relationships.
Oh, and we used to joke all of the time about the advice that I would get on my appearance, and also how contradictory it was. I couldn't go to an event without being told I should wear my hair up or down, or I had not enough makeup or too much makeup, or I should wear more color, or I should wear more black, or pants, or a skirt. And it puts you in this bind. And I think ultimately I decided you can either listen to all the noise and try to be who other people want you to be, or you can be yourself. And in my opinion, the candidates who are most compelling on the campaign trail aren't those that try to fit some cookie cutter mold, but the ones who are truly authentic to themselves, to their values, who know why they're running and what they're fighting for, and they just lay it all out there.
Men on the campaign trail deal with that too. They wear makeup on they talk about their tie color or their suit color. You don't want anyone going out in a tan suit because that's controversial. But it just feels like it's different for women. It's an extension of the policing that we have generally in society, I think,
I think it is qualitatively different for women. I think you get it more often. I think you get it with greater intensity, and I think people feel entitled to critique and police women in a way that they don't men. And I think part of that stems from the fact that for so long in our history, we've primarily been represented by men and a certain type of men, and it's going to take a lot more mold breaking, a lot more diverse candidates running in order for us to have representatives that actually look more like America, and in order for us not to be stuck in these preconceived notions about what it means to be an elected leader in our country.
You bring up an interesting point that I've talked to a few people about, and I'm just curious about what your take on this is. So yes, we need a more representative government, right? Mm-hmm. But in a lot of districts, that means unseating a Democratic incumbent because, even on the Democratic side, most of the people who are in elected office are men. And if we want more diversity, sometimes that's what it means. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, look, what I feel ultimately is that each district has the right to choose who's going to represent that district. And they have a right to choose representatives who reflect their values and their community. The reason we have primaries is to allow a whole range of candidates to run. And just because you've been in office for a very long time, that doesn't preclude other candidates from jumping in and challenging or questioning whether you in fact have represented the district well or will continue to represent the district well in the future. In my opinion, that's healthy for democracy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, right? I mean, of course, it depends on what candidate you're trying to primary. And, if it's someone who's a long time beloved figure in a certain community, politics aside, you really have to consider the optics of that campaign.
100%, right? And I think with politics, it's really hard to make blanket assertions that apply across the entirety of the United States, this great, big, and diverse country that we have. But as a general matter, I think the system works best when it's more open, when it's more inclusive, and when more people have a voice.
So 2018 was great for Democrats, and I think now we're even having a lot of success with legislative seats. I think the DLCC just announced the other day that we flipped 450 seats from red to blue, exactly. Something like that, which is insane and in a good way. But it still feels like we've got this pandemic, which is a huge issue. And if you were to launch your campaign now, do you think that you could have the same success that you had in 2018 with getting a large number of votes? And how would you do things differently?
I think running a campaign during a global pandemic would be an entirely different beast. And I've thought about that a lot, actually. Like I said, running for office is really challenging. It's all consuming. It is taxing physically. It's taxing emotionally. But COVID-19, it's really upended everything we know about how you traditionally run campaigns. So if you think about it, the bread and butter of being on the campaign trail is person to person contact. It's being out there knocking doors and shaking hands and holding meet and greets and speaking at local Democratic clubs. None of that's possible in an era of social distancing. Then you think about what it means for fundraising. So many grassroots campaigns depend on small dollar contributions. But is it even possible to ask for small dollar contributions when you've got unemployment rates approaching 25%, when the people who are likely to give in $5 or $10 or $20 amounts are the people being hardest hit? And then what do you do when the folks who are traditional, more large dollar donors are feeling the burden of having to give to a presidential campaign and gubernatorial races and Senate races and congressional races in this very important election year? And then think about possibly layering on top of that what it means if you're caring for someone who's sick with COVID-19, if you've lost your childcare, if maybe you as a candidate yourself have lost your job. So there's a whole range of things that I think are making campaigns particularly challenging this year, and especially challenging for minority and first-time candidates who might not have the resources at their disposal that other candidates have. I have to be honest, this is part of why I'm making such an effort this year in my own work to be supporting diverse candidates and supporting them up and down the ballot, as you said, not only at the congressional level, but at the state and local level as well, because victory there is really what's going to help change policies from the ground up in our country. And, I think if I were a candidate right now, it would really be a test of creativity. How can you use new means of communication to reach out to voters? How can you, hit the phones to make sure that you're trying to substitute for what you might get on the doors? How can you be present in a meaningful way in your community without physically being present? It's really hard. And I think that's why it's incumbent upon all of us who aren't running, but who really care about outcomes, to be supportive of candidates this year.
Yeah, a couple of silver linings. I've never managed a campaign, and I know you're a strategist too. I'm just curious what you think about this. I mean, one silver lining is that you've got a captured audience. They're not going anywhere, and so you can have Zoom events, you can have live streaming events, and your audience is right there. I mean, you do have to compete for the time that they have during the day, but they don't have to worry about travel time. They're going to be there waiting for something to watch. And the second thing is that I would imagine that it is cheaper now because you don't have travel costs, right? Flying to different campaign events is, I would imagine, really costly.
Yeah, well, on the first point, I think there is something to the fact that people are at home and therefore are more likely to pick up the phone if you call. I have spoken to a bunch of folks who are on the campaign trail and others who are running campaigns right now who said they've never had such a high pickup rate when they're calling people on the phones. And then not only are people answering, but they're willing to chat. And, that's great to me, because that's always what you crave as a candidate, is that one-to-one interaction with a potential constituent, an opportunity to hear about what's on their mind and to have a conversation with them about why you would best represent them in office. Now, on the other point you mentioned about whether this means costs are lower, I actually might disagree with you a little bit there, because I think the things that a lot of folks don't realize is that it actually costs money to meaningfully communicate with your voters, especially if you're a first-time candidate, because you don't enjoy inherently the benefit of your name being well known. You might not have at the outset a huge following. And that's built up by introducing yourself to people. So in order to get people at a Zoom event and continually get new people at a Zoom event, you might need to do things like pay for advertising on a medium like Facebook about an event to boost attendance. You're still going to need to hire staff who are going to help you set up your events and staff them. All of the mechanics of a campaign remains there. And so it still does remain an endeavor that's costly at a time when it's really challenging to raise money. So, I've heard that it's still pretty hard for folks, especially in these lower profile races at a state and local level where they just aren't getting as much attention.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
And so, I don't know if you've been following the efforts to shift to vote by mail and absentee ballots, right? I mean, everyone's following that. But recently I read a piece where Republicans were investing, or they were planning to invest millions, maybe billions, to hire, over 50,000 volunteers in 15 or so key states to monitor polling places and to quote unquote challenge ballots, right? And I was reading that. And, I think we know what challenging ballots actually means, right? That's just a way to intimidate people and to, slow down the voting process or to discourage people from voting. This is why I guess they're opposing vote by mail. But I just wonder, what you think Democrats can do to counter those efforts. I mean, they've been doing this kind of thing for years.
You're right. Voter suppression, voter intimidation, those things are real. And there's a very active effort by the Republican Party to suppress the vote because they know that if more people, and particularly more diverse people, get out and vote, they have less of a likelihood of winning elections. I think we need to get back to basics. Voting is a fundamental right in our country. It's a right enjoyed by every man and woman. And expanding access to the vote, it should be a nonpartisan issue. When it comes to thinking about November, we need to make sure that no person has to choose between whether they stay healthy and whether they exercise that fundamental right to vote. So things that Democrats need to be focusing on are expanding vote by mail, making that universal, expanding access to voter registration, expanding early voting as well, and making sure that there's early voting not only during working hours, but on nights and weekends as well, so that shift workers can take place. You can do things like with vote by mail, ensuring that postage is paid on the return, and also ensuring that you count a ballot as long as it's postmarked by Election Day. It doesn't have to arrive by Election Day. These are pretty simple measures. They'll take time to implement. They'll take money to implement. But what they'll guarantee is that come November, in what's arguably the most important election of our lifetimes, everyone, man, woman, Republican, Democrat, has a chance to have their voice be heard. And that's really something we all should be able to get behind as Democrats. It's something that I'm working very hard to do in my personal capacity as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Florida Democratic Party. We need to make sure that this right can be exercised on November 3rd.
Right. It really isn't a simple thing. I live in Washington State where we have vote by mail. We've had it for a while, and it's pretty seamless, right? I think just in the past year, they've added postage or, postage isn't required on the envelopes. And, that took a while. That took several years to get all of the pieces in place. So it doesn't seem like it's a non-issue for states who've never had anything close to this to get that in place by November.
I think it's something that is very important to do if we're honest about wanting to make sure the right to vote is something that's enjoyed by everyone. And if you look at the way the Republican Party has behaved, I think that honestly, what scares them about vote by mail is that it works, is that it increases the number of people who show up at the polls. But elections are competitive. You don't get to choose your voters. You have to earn them. And so we should really be working hard to ensure that everyone can vote come November.
Well, voter suppression is a lot harder when they aren't there in person. So, I mean, that's the obvious reason, right? But I want to ask you, because you were a foreign policy expert, like I mentioned earlier with the Obama administration for Hillary Clinton and Samantha Power, who I have coincidentally been a huge fan of since she wrote the book. Was it A Problem from Hell? Which is an excellent book. Everyone should read that. And I just want to ask about your thoughts on the primaries, right? The Democratic primaries. And I felt, I don't know how many of the presidential debates you watched, right? There were probably like 5 dozen of them. It felt like there were 5 dozen of them. But I felt like there was not a lot of focus on foreign policy, right? I mean, there's some really important domestic issues that they were talking about, which again, they're really important, healthcare and some other things. But I think that given the moment and given the place that we're in, in the country and with this administration, foreign policy is it's always been important, but it's even more important now. What do you think about kind of the lack of focus on that during the primaries?
I think it's often difficult for most Americans to understand why foreign policy is important to their day-to-day lives, especially when their primary concerns on a day-to-day basis might be bread and butter issues. Am I earning enough money? Do I have affordable health care? Are my kids getting a good education? And I think because of that, oftentimes, and as we saw in this primary, domestic policy issues take up the bulk of the time. But if anyone questioned the importance of foreign policy, or stated differently, questioned the importance of U.S. leadership in the world, the COVID-19 pandemic should disabuse them of that notion, because I think what this has laid bare is how important it is that America not only has a seat at the table, but a seat at the head of the table, and is leading global coalitions to solve big, complex problems like pandemics. And I think what we've seen in the failure of the Trump administration in their retreat from American leadership on the global stage is the repercussions of such actions. We now have closing in on 100,000 dead Americans from a crisis that was avoidable if the United States had exercised a little bit more leadership earlier on. So I think people will be recognizing going into the general election how important it is to have a president who understands America's place in the world, who understands the importance of building relationships and coalitions with other countries, and who can be trusted to fight for our values on the world stage.
Right. I guess you're right. I mean, I think the average person does think about the domestic policy because it's something that they can see and they live through every day. And you're right. I think that expecting a candidate or hoping that they'll demonstrate some fluency in foreign policy is kind of something for political nerd types who, pay attention to these things and, want to know exactly what a candidate's going to do about North Korea, for instance. Right. And I know that Hillary Clinton was, one of those candidates who was kind of unmatched in that area. Like her foreign policy chops were really, really strong. But anyway, I'm just curious about what you think about, having a candidate that's fluent in that and them being able to demonstrate it. And also, I don't know if you remember following Bush's candidacy, when there was a transition from Bush to Obama, we were really in a bad place internationally as far as, America's reputation. I mean, how do you think about repairing image internationally?
So, Jen, I think you're absolutely right. American leadership and credibility does really matter on the world stage. And we lost some of that during the George W. Bush administration. I'll never forget, I was actually a graduate student in the United Kingdom during the Bush administration at the start of the Iraq War, and seeing the impact of the actions of that administration and the way that my classmates from around the world responded, and in many ways were appalled by what the United States was doing. That was one of my first lessons in the real power of the United States on the world stage, and the importance of leadership that's in alignment with our values. I spent 6 years in the Obama administration from early 2011 all the way till the end of the administration. And even in those last years, we were still taking steps to regain our credibility, to show that our word was good and that we were going to act in a way that was aligned with both American values and American law. And, when I look at what's happened during the Trump years, all I think about is how we're going to have to take steps to regain that credibility again, how challenging it's going to be to step back into that void and say, we know we've been acting in a manner that's inconsistent with that American commitment to liberty and justice and equality for all, but trust us now, we really mean it this time. But yet, at the same time, I've heard from my colleagues who are still in places like the State Department that other countries are craving U.S. leadership, that they miss us taking a more active role. And so what I think is going to be required next year is that if a President Biden wins, that he reasserts U.S. power and U.S. leadership, that he does it in a manner that's consistent with our values, but he also does so with a degree of humility, recognizing that the last several years have been hard, that they haven't been perfect on the home front, and that we've got to work hard always to prove that we're fighting for what's right.
Well, Lauren Baer, thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you on the campaign trail again or somewhere in an administration, or just hope to see you. And
thanks so much, Jen. I would love to chat again. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for listening. The Electorette is independently created and produced by me, Jen Taylor Skinner. And of course, I'm the host. But I also do all of the editing, the audio, and the graphics. You name it, it's on my plate. So if you enjoyed this episode of the Electorette, please help the Electorette grow by subscribing. Just hit the subscribe button on whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. Also leave a review for the Electorette on iTunes. Lastly, one final way to help the Electorette is by following the Electorette on social media. That's at Electorette on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep up the good fight.